All right. Welcome, everyone, to another Monday edition of our World Jewish Travel. Today, our talk is on the Bene Israel of India. And uh, without further ado, I just want to turn it over to our presenter, Eliaz, who is going to tell us his story. And I hope it's got as much information as he's already shared with me. So I'm looking forward to it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. And we will also have some time at the very end for a Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Eliaz.
Hi, everyone. So I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm just going to share screen and going to start. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the Bene Israel of India community. It's one of the Jewish communities originating from India. And my name is Eliaz Ruben Dandeker. I am a Bene Israel myself. I'm a descendant of the leaders of the community, the presidents of the community from the 18th century. I'm a writer. I'm a publisher. I have my own publishing house. I'm a lecturer. I have a large archive in regard of the community, or in regard of the whole different variety of Jewish communities in India. And I'm also vice CEO of Masale, which is a organization, a nonprofit organization of the culture of the Jews of India in Israel and abroad. And I lecture mainly about the Jews of India. Sometimes I lecture also about military-related PTSD and about classical art, especially in Indian or Jewish regard. And as I said, my story begins even before I was born, because I was born into this community, and I was born and raised in Israel, where I live today, with me being actually the fourth generation in my hometown of Or Akiva, which is in the south side of northern Israel. And I grew up on the traditions, the culture, the history, and customs, the languages, the different languages of our community, because there are several languages. And one of them, like there is Yiddish and Ladino, for example, in other Jewish communities, and also other Hebrew Jewish languages. There's also the Marathi of the Bene Israel, which is Judeo-Marathi. And let's start. So when I say the Bene Israel of India, we are just one community out of several communities, several Jewish communities in the Indian subcontinent. And the Bene Israel of India, which is the largest community, our origins compiled in our chronicles are from around 175 BC, BCE actually today, as correctly. And there's also the Jews of Cochin that arrived in several ways. Some of them said to arrive in the times of King Solomon and throughout the centuries and generations until the 19th century. There are the Baghdadi Jews, and that they are Jews that traveled and arrived actually from Arab-speaking countries or kingdoms, or Muslim countries. And they started to arrive to the Indian subcontinent between the 17th century, as far as we know, until the 20th century, as latest as we know. There's also the Bene Menashe group, which by their records arrived around the 3rd century. And they were just recognized a few decades ago. So unlike the other three groups I've talked about, they started to migrate or make aliyah, as we said here, just in the past few decades. There's also the Bnei Ephraim, and they are also sometimes called the Bnei Tzion. And views differ on their origins. Some say they came in the 1st century AD, some say in the 10th century. And besides these around 5 major groups, there are other smaller groups. There's also Ashkenazi Jews that came during the centuries to India. There's Sephardic Jews, there are Persian Jews, Arabian Jews, and etc. And these pictures are some different representations of the different Hebrew or Jewish communities in India. And when I talk about the larger Indian Jewish community, so one needs to remember that India is a very large country in many perspectives. And the Jewish Indian communities were spread out from south to west, from east to north. And there were cultural centers, sometimes without any connection between each other, and sometimes with scarce connection, sometimes with very tight connections. Now, on the left, we can see some of the major points of Jewish settlements or Jewish communities around the Indian subcontinent. And on the right side, we see the villages of the Bene Israel of India. Now, these villages are situated just south of modern-day Mumbai, or as it was known back then as Bombay. And the Bene Israeli settlements were around roughly 250 or so. And today, actually, some of the villages are no longer in existence. So some of the names, just names of the areas, the villages, the towns, they remained in memory, in records, and sometimes only in a family name. Now, the Jewish diaspora of India during the British Raj was the rule of the British on the Indian subcontinent and its appendix. So there was most of the Jewish communities stayed in what is today known as India and parts of Pakistan or modern-day Pakistan, especially in the city of Karachi. Some of them also arrived in Yemen, especially in the port of Aden from around 1839. And some of them went to Myanmar, or as it was known back then as Burma, especially in the city of Rangoon. And you can still find evidences in the other areas, although the population is no longer, it doesn't exist there anymore. But some of the synagogues largely doesn't exist. There are some remnants here and there, but you can see the synagogues. Sometimes you can also see the cemeteries. But in India, the community still is a very active community, although smaller than it used to be. Now, I will focus mainly about the Bene Israel of India. And as I said, some chronicles date our arrival to around 175 BC, after all the proceedings that led to the holiday of Hanukkah, for example. So in our records, we left before, and we left probably from the north of the Galilee and went to Egypt. In Egypt, there was a large Hebrew community, especially in the island of Yeb, or Elephantine. And there was also a Jewish temple, a Hebrew temple. And from there, we went on ships, the community sailed towards India. Then they were caught in a storm, and they were shipwrecked. Some estimates say that around between 100 to 1,000 people drowned and died, and there were 14 survivors. The first 7 couples as we call them. And you can see on the right side, actually, it's a monument. This is a modern monument that it was started to, it's in the village of Nogao. Nogao is said to be the first place the survivors washed ashore. And this monument, this obelisk, they started to build it around 1925. It was finished in around the 70s. But around that monument are ancient graves, ancient burial mounds, and some of them date hundreds of years. Some are estimated at more than 2,000 years. And more archaeological study must be done, but I saw evidences of tombstone centuries old from the writings. And the painting on the left is one of a variation of a painting that described the arrival of the ancestors, as we call them. Now, when the first wave arrived, or actually they were shipwrecked, they came into an more or less an alien environment, although there were connections between India and what is known today as Israel and the whole Middle East, the Roman Empire, the Greek empires, and so on and so forth. There were connections. There was also one area called the Port of Chiol that in archaeological sites around that area, we can find Roman coins and Greek coins. You can see influences of Indian philosophy in ancient Greece or Rome. So it was not a completely unknown civilization, but it was alien to the people that were shipwrecked there. Now, when they arrived there, so the story goes at least, that a small child around 8 years old, he saw bodies laying around the beach. He saw broken wood. So he saw there was the ship drowned, and he went and he called his parents. They didn't believe it, and he convinced them to come. They saw the people, and then they called the village elders and the Brahmin. The Brahmins are the priests in the Hindu religion, and they thought everybody died. So the right thing to do, in their point of view, was to cremate them. So they started to build up piles of fire, of wood, and from the heat, some of them started to wake up. So they stopped, and these were, in fact, the 14 original survivors. Now, the villagers took them under their wing, and some estimates, I mean, some conclusions say that they managed to converse in some languages, maybe in Greek, maybe in another language that was more or less known, maybe in Aramaic, also some people suggested. But nevertheless, the people there, the Hindus, offered them homes, they offered them a place to stay, and the area that they arrived is called the Kunakan Valley, or the Hidden Valley. Now, this is one of the most fertile areas in India that I know of. So the place was rich in soil and rich in food, and the people were forthcoming, so they stayed there. And through the generations, they kept the elements of the faith that their ancestors brought from the Middle East, and they continued some prayers in Hebrew. And some scholars said that Hebrew was not known except one prayer. It's called the Shema. But recent studies, and also I found it in archives and in my research, that Hebrew was known for centuries in the community. Now, this community started to grow slowly but surely, and they started to multiply, and also other Hebrew arrivals came and joined the community, Some of them probably when Islam rose in the Arabian Peninsula, so there was an exile of a lot of Hebrews or Jews. Some of them went to the Middle East, some of them went to what is today Turkey and other places. Some of them stayed and converted, and some of them actually went to India. So some of those ones that came to India joined by marriage to the existing Bene Israel community. Now, we are called Bene Israel because all the Jews are Bene Israel. It's one of the ancient names. But most of the Jewish communities or the Hebrew communities changed the name during the course of the ages. And most are called Jews today. But we just kept the original name. So as time progressed and different rulers ruled over the area, be it the Hindus, the Maratha Hindus, or the Mughal Muslims, the Bene Israel community was quite small in numbers in compared to the other communities, other populations, be it the Muslims, the Christians, or the Hindus, of course, who are the majority, and also some other communities like the Zoroastrians. So we didn't bother, let's say we didn't bother any, or we didn't pose a threat to the local rule. So we were combined in the government. We were also considered as neutral. And some of the Bene Israel rose in the ranks to be high officials and high-ranking officers in the armies and navies of the different empires. And because the Muslim empire, for example, saw us as brethren in a way, so because the Bene Israel are written in the Quran, so we were treated equally, more or less. And the Hindus also saw us as just another caste. So we had a place. India is a very pluralistic place, more or less, and especially for small minorities. And so we had it comfortable. There was almost no anti-Semitism, especially in the first centuries. And the community got more or less equal rights, and they were respected, and they lived very peacefully with their neighbors. Even when the other neighbors were fighting each other or in wars, like especially between Hindus and Muslims, the Bene Israel mainly was spared because we were not Hindus and we were not Muslims, of course. Now, things started to change with the British rule or the British invasion into the Indian subcontinent. First, they ruled through the British East India Company. And before the British came, Bombay, for example, was under Portuguese rule for a certain amount of time, and they brought with them the Inquisition. So the Bene Israel kept their distance from Bombay, but Bombay was given as a dowry payment in the 17th century to England. And the Bene Israel started to move towards Bombay, which started to become slowly a metropolis. And they started to enlist in the ranks of the British. And there they found opportunities. Now, there were different types of or groups or families of Bene Israelis that some of them were scholars, and they studied, and they were doing the religious ceremony like the circumcision, or conducting the wedding ceremony, the chuppah, as we say. And some of them were artisans. Some of them, of course, as I said, were soldiers. Some of them were poets. Some of them worked as in agriculture. But everything started to change when the British came. And when the British came and they saw the Bene Israel community, they saw an opportunity because it was a small minority, again, not posing a threat, and they found a common language. Now, in the beginning, let's say from the 18th century, some missionaries also started to come to India in order to convert to the Christian faith, especially different small communities, especially Hindus or some Muslims. And they came to the Bene Israel community. Now, one of the religious clergymen, his name was John Wilson, and you can see him on the right side in this presentation. This is a picture he took in, I think, around Hebron or somewhere around what is called today Israel. And he was very interested in the Bene Israel community. And instead of converting or trying to convert the Bene Israeli, which had almost zero success, he was infatuated by the Bene Israel community, and he started to open schools translating the Bible into the Marathi language and into English, and starting to teach also the larger Bene Israel community Hebrew. In the beginning, there were 3 families that conducted the religious rites of the Bene Israelis. These were the Rajpurkar family, the Shapurkar family, and the Jiratker family. And it went from generation to generation. It was passed down to the generations, starting probably, as our chronicles say, from the times of Maimonides, or the brother of Maimonides, that his name, which name was David. And it was, in one hand, a closed community, and it kept close relations. And on the other hand, it was we were an adventurous community, so we wanted new opportunities and new connections. And things started to change around the 18th century and 19th century with the move of the migration into Greater Bombay. And people started to, first of all, go more in depth into the academic world. They started to be, in the beginning, of course, they enlisted in the ranks of the militias, the British militias. And there they saw a chance to gain wealth and also to provide for the future generations, their children. Now, the schools were for boys and girls together. I mean, the education back in those days was even more equal in the community in comparison to other places in India and also in Europe or in some places around the world, because the schools were open for boys and girls who became men and women afterwards, and them themselves, they started to teach others. And so there was a great emphasis on the academic world, and slowly they started to leave army life and the ranks of the British militias and afterwards the British army, and started to go into other fields. As the community established, they started to get higher ranks and positions in local government. Now, in these pictures that we see here on the upper left side and the picture just next to it, these are one of the first photographs of the Bene Israel that we know of today. It was photographed around 1855 and 1856. And actually, the person in the middle upper part, his descendant is a good friend of mine today. She's a journalist in Israel. And on the upper right-hand side, we can see Miss Dandeker, or Hannah by Dandeker. She used to build synagogues along the 19th century. And there were scholars, there were Hebrew teachers in the university. And the Bene Israel, in the beginnings, I mean, let's say around 500 years ago, they used to pray in small prayer halls. And when the community became larger, it started to build synagogues. The first synagogue in Bombay was built in 1796. by two brothers, Samuel Ezekiel Dandeker and Isaac Ezekiel Dandeker. And afterwards, it just diversed, and the community started to spread out all over India, to the cities, to other places. Now, the community started to go in other fields as well. And as I said before, in government, and also the armed forces of the officials, and also in education. Many started to become doctors, and we can see on the upper right side, the mayor of Bombay between 1936 and 1937 was Dr. Elijah Moses Rajpurkil. And in the middle, we can see the leader of the Bene Israel community from 1937 to around 1957. She was Miss Rebecca Ruben Nogauker. And this photograph is actually taken in a kibbutz in Israel in 1947. And one of the leading doctors was Dr. Jerusha Girard. We can see on the left side, and she was actually one of the members that led the women's rights movement in India. She organized a Jewish women's organization called Stri Mandil, which is the temple, the women's temple. After, in 1913, in 1925, she opened a liberal synagogue, a reform synagogue in India that was active until 1993, where Hebrew, or especially Bene Israeli intellectuals were meeting and talking about the future of the community. Now, with the move of the community into the larger cities, from an agricultural community, more or less, it became a more rural community. And it started to spread out, as I said, not only in what we know today is India, but also outside of India. And one of the major places or cities that the community built itself was in Karachi, in modern-day Pakistan. There they built synagogues. The cemeteries are still existing today. And the community started to spread all over. Now, things started to change in 2 points in history. In 1856, 1857 was the Great Indian Mutiny, where local Maharajas and local emperors and queens started to revolt against British influence. And it was brutal. 2 years of war that devastated the country almost, and some of the local army revolted, but the majority stayed loyal to the British. And it was not uncommon to see sometimes cousins or brothers in different sides of the war fighting each other, especially when you talk about the Bene Israel community, which is in the 1850s, we were around, let's say around 8,000, maybe even less. So it's a very small community. And I have two of my ancestors, for example, that one of them supported the British and one of them revolted against the British, and they fought each other. And through the ages, they came together and I was born. Their descendants, at least. So, and the other major shift point was the freedom movement in India that started with the Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the spiritual leader, the spiritual father of modern day India. Now, when he started the freedom movement, the non-violent freedom movement, the Satyagraha, so many Bene Israelis were infatuated by it. And in one point, his doctor and his lawyer were the Irulker brothers, It was Solomoni Rulker and Abrahami Rulker. And in the famous Salt March of 1930s, many Bene Israelis, including my grandfather and other Bene Israeli women and men, marched with him for Indian independence. In 1947, when India got its independence, part of it was split into Pakistan, or what is known today as Pakistan. And between the two newly formed countries, actually, there was an unofficial war or an official war, because there were massacres in both sides, and the Bene Israel community started to flee modern day Pakistan. Back then, the synagogue was damaged. Many started to leave. There were massacres between the Hindus and the Muslims, and some reports say 1 million or more were killed, and the Bene Israel community was caught in the middle. On the other hand, some Bene Israelis were chosen to go to the front line or to the borderline in order to save people on both sides, because we were not Muslims and we were not Hindus, so we were considered neutral. Now I'll talk just a little bit about the holidays and traditions that we have. One of the major figures in the Bene Israel tradition is Elijah the prophet. Some say we are descendants of the priesthood clan of the Kohanim that supported Elijah the prophet, or Elijah back then, when he was lecturing around Israel, in Haifa in particular. And this was not forgotten during the ages. When we arrived to India, some accounts say that Elijah the prophet was revealed to our ancestors and promised them that one day they will come back to Israel. Now, that was around 2,200 years ago. 1,000 years ago, there was the second revelation of Elijah, according to our traditions. And there is a place called the hoof mark of Elijah Hanabi, or the prophet, horse marks. And that is in a place called Kandala. You can see hoof marks and chariot marks, like they were melted into the stone. And this place is a pilgrimage place. It's respected by Hindus and Muslims as well. And you can find Hebrew writings around that area. Now, one of the ceremonies that was developed in our community in India is the Malida ceremony. Now, some accounts say the Malida ceremony is a variation of one of the old ceremonies held by the priests in the temple of Jerusalem. And it's changed through the ages, and today we celebrate it in auspicious occasions, in weddings, and in births, if somebody goes to university, if you buy a new house, if any happy occasion, we do this ceremony. But according to our traditions, it started in Hebrew, what is called Tu B'Shvat, is one of the holidays. So we started in that specific time, and it spread out to be in every happy occasion. Now, you can see on the upper right side a preparation of matzot in the Passover holiday. And this is a depiction from 1874 from the Pune Haggadah. And it's written in Hebrew and Marathi, and you can see the women making the matzah. On the left upper side, you can see the mark of the hand. Now, in ancient Jewish traditions, like the times when Moses took us out of Egypt, and in order to save the Hebrew firstborns, they marked the doorway with a bloodied hand, as sacrificed a goat and put the hand in, and they put the mark of the hand. Now, today, the community does not intend to kill animals, and they use paint or they use wine, red wine, and they put it on a paper, so you don't have to clean it up afterwards. And they became a little bit different than in ancient times. And this photograph actually is from a Hebrew house, a Jewish house, a Bene Israeli house in India that I photographed around 2015. And now more traditions, if you can see on the photograph on the left side bottom, it's actually a family photograph of mine from 1949 with my grandparents, my two aunts on the sides, and the person sitting in the middle is my father. Now, he has long hair, which was not that common back then for Jews in India, but there was a tradition called like Samson from the Bible. If something happened, if the child was, it's a Hebrew tradition, it's an ancient Hebrew tradition, the child was sick or he had brothers or children before him that passed away. So in order for the child to be safe for 7 years, it's called Nazir Shimshon or Samson hermit. For 7 years, they did not cut the hair. So there were a lot of Hebrew traditions that mainly were forgotten, or some of them at least were forgotten afterwards in other Jewish traditions or other Jewish communities. And you could have seen them, especially in the Bene Israeli community, and also the Beta Israel of the Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, the ketubah, or the marriage certificate, was very specific, like marriage certificates, the Jewish marriage certificates of ketubah in North America or South America, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, and other countries. Each and every country, the Jewish community took aspects of the local customs or the local community and intertwined them in the ketubahs, in the marriage certificate. This is a Bene Israeli marriage certificate, and you can see the peacocks, you can see the lotus flowers, you can see Hebrew intertwined with the lions, the symbol of the king of Judah, as we used to call it, and also ancient Hebrew down. Now, I don't know if I can put a small portion of a video. I don't know if it will work. We can try, and if it doesn't, so we just carry on. There is a song that the bridegroom sings to the bride in the marriage ceremony, in the chuppah. In ancient times, they used to do the marriage ceremony in the synagogue. Nowadays, in Israel, at least, it's not that common anymore. But I did my marriage ceremony in the synagogue, but many don't. But there is a song. It's called Yonati Zivi Fatech. It's an ancient song written by Rabbi Israel Najara in the I think it was in the 16th century. And usually this song is sang to the bride as she approaches the groom. And let's see if we can hear just a little bit of it in Hebrew, of course.
Yonati Ziv Yif'ater Damalik Sil Bekimot Bani Le Ahavater Ashir Shir Al Alamot
This was just a small sample out of it. Now, as I said, the community started to spread and started to go into other fields. One of them was the theater and the movies. Now, during the 19th century, there were a lot of famous stage actors in India who were actually Bene Israelis. On the left side, you can see the actor Dandeker, who was in one part the leader of the community, because the Dandeker family from 1784 became the presidents of the community. And he was also the president of the community, and he was also a famous actor. And played Romeo and Juliet in the Urdu language. He played the Merchant of Venice. He played other Shah Jahan, which is a more Mughal style play. On the other side, you can on the right side, sorry, you can see the actor Varulkar, Aaron Varulkar, if I'm not mistaken. And they became more famous because in the 19th century, acting was not such a common profession for many people in India. It was considered, with British influences, not so respectable, but fortunately the Bene Israel didn't see any problems with it, and they became famous. And when it gained popularity, actually some of the first Bollywood actors, as of course in the US there is Hollywood, there is Bollywood in India. Some of the first actors and playwrights and directors were actually Bene Israelis. Now you can see on the upper left side a poster for a movie called Alam Ara. And this is the first talkie in the Indian cinema. And it was actually written by a Bene Israel called Joseph David Penker. And Joseph David Penker is the one sitting with the large mustache in the upper middle part, and he's considered the father of talking cinema in India. And you can see other actresses, actors during the ages. If on the left side bottom is one of the most famous actors. He used to be called David Actor, it's kind of a stage name, but he was David Abraham Chiulkar, and he passed away in Canada. And so from 1912, the start of Indian cinema, there were a lot of Bene Israelis intertwined in it, photographers, actors, actresses, as I said. And during the ages, it started to change because it became more popular, and more actors and actresses who were Hindus and who were Muslims, who were Christians, they started to find the acting profession more open. So it started to change. Now, Eretz Israel, or the Aliyah, the migration. Back then, it was known maybe as the Great Assyria, or Palestine, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Name changed. The first evidence that we see of Bene Israelis visiting this area from our records is confirmed to 1855. And we can find it in records of other travelers. From the middle 19th century onwards, there were travelers, as they came travelers from other countries, especially Jewish travelers. Also, Bene Israeli started to come and visit this area. And in 1880, in 1894, two travel journals were written and published several years afterwards of Bene Israelis that came and traveled around the country. They saw the Jewish settlements, they saw the Muslim settlements, and they were talking about the communities here. They started to see Jews from Yemen and Jews from Poland and Jews from other places started to come and build new settlements, and they started to spread the word on it. Now, in this picture, we can see a photograph of the Temple Mount. This is the Kamar Leker family from Karachi in 1902. And they traveled and photographed their journey and published on it. On the left side bottom, we can see a well and a commemorative marble plaque from 1865, donated by the Bene Israelis in the tomb of Rachel, where it still stands until today. This is a recent photograph, of course, and it's written, "This well was built by the generosity of the high-ranking officials, our brothers, the Bene Israel, who sit in the city of Bombay," so on and so forth. And we see more of the travelers to what is called today Israel. You can see also a photograph from Luxor in Egypt. And these two travelers, one of them is called Dr. Shirkulker. Shirkulker is the family name, and Mr. Gosalker is the family name. And they also have commemorative plaques around Israel from the 19th century in their regard, but their names were changed into more Ashkenazi style names. So some people don't understand that these are Bene Israelis. And with the traveler towards Jerusalem especially, but also other places here, and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the journey became shorter. So more and more people started to come, and more Bene Israelis started to arrive. Now, in 1897, Theodor Herzl invited the Bene Israel community to take part in the first Zionist convention in Basel, in Switzerland, but they respectively declined back then. They said they will support financially, they send money, they send donations, but they said, we will not make aliyah, we will not migrate to the land of Israel because we are waiting for the times of the Messiah. The community was a very religious community, very open-minded, but religious in the same time. So they did not physically support the Zionist movement, but they just supported it with financially, especially. That changed in the First World War. In the First World War, with the British fighting against the Ottoman Empire, which ruled this area, the Ottomans started to lose the battle and lose their empire. And in the British ranks, there were Bene Israeli officers that started to arrive here and started to hear more about the Zionist idea of resettling the land or coming back to the land. And they started to say, okay, if Jews from all over the place, all over the world actually come, so maybe this is the times of the Messiah. So they started to spread the word. When they went back to India, they started to talk about migration and building settlements. Some of them came back from the Great War, as it was called back then, the First World War. They came in a very harsh condition because some of them were shell-shocked, what we know today is PTSD, and their wartime experiences affected them deeply, but they jump-started the Bene Israel Zionist movement, and they started to meet, they started to have conventions, and they started to talk about the option of moving as a community, or as groups at least, towards establishing new settlements in what is today Israel. And second, by the way, this photograph is possibly, it's an assumption, possibly the earliest photograph of a Bene Israel in Jerusalem. This is in Kerem Avraham. This photograph was taken in 1855. And if you can see on the left side, there's three individuals, three people sitting. The middle person with the white beard, some people suggested that he is the Bene Israeli that was written about in a journal of a person or a nun called Mary Elijah Rogers that wrote and described him almost the same as this person looks, in the same area and the same time, but this is an assumption. It's not an official fact. Now, during the First World War, the Bene Israel started to talk about migrating into this area. It took time. They sent finances towards supporting existing settlements and new settlements. And in 1924, the first records, we can see that they started to migrate in small numbers. And this again changed in the 1930s with the outbreak of the Second World War and the influx of Jews from all over the world, especially from Europe. And during the Second World War, there were thousands of Jews arriving into India in the influence of the person who later became the first president of India, or the first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who convinced the British to allow doctors and engineers and other people in high-ranking positions who were Jewish to come to India, and also their families. Now, when they arrived to India, some of the first people that took them in were Bene Israelis, Baghdadi Jews, Kochini Jews. They came to the synagogues. Some of them started to intermarry with the other Bene Israelis or other communities, or Jewish communities, of course. And in 1942, we see the first casualty of the community towards the establishment of an independent state of Israel. You can see his picture on the upper left side. This is Lieutenant Ashtamker, Ellis Raphael Ashtamker, who fell in battle in 1942 while he was in Iraq, while he was helping Jewish refugees, both Iraqi Jews and both Polish Jews, to cross over to Palestine, Eretz Israel, or what is today Israel, and he was killed in a crossfire, and he's considered the first casualty. In 1948, there came a group, when we have some records about that, of around between 40 to 50, especially Bene Israelis, but also some Baghdadis and Kochinis, veterans of the Second World War, in order to fight for the independence of Israel. And out of those 40 or 50, accounts vary, 28 are said to fall in battle. And from 1949, we can see larger numbers of Bene Israeli groups starting to migrate or make aliyah to Israel. On the upper right side, you can see the first group that was that arrived in 1949, the first large group at least. And on the photograph in the bottom, you can see the same group dancing the Horror dance, Israeli folk dance, in the end of 1949, early 1950 in Kibbutz Afikim, in a kibbutz. And as soon as India was established and the fightings started to begin between India and Pakistan, and Israel was established, so in their eyes, the area was unstable in one hand, and the second hand, in the synagogues in India, across India, they always were praying to come back to the land of the ancestors. So they saw it as the time of the Messiah in a way, and in another way, in India, it was not certain what's going to happen. So more and more numbers started to migrate to Israel. And as soon as they left, more and more started to leave, and brothers and sisters, and then the parents started to come, and then more cousins. And soon enough, we saw thousands of Bene Israelis starting to leave India, although most of them never felt or suffered from anti-Semitism. Now, when the Bene Israel started to come to Israel, we were not Ashkenazi, we were not Sephardic. We were kind of different in the whole outline of Jewish communities, although there were Yemenite Jews, there were North African Jews here, of course, and there were also Ethiopian Jews back then, but we were just another minority, and we were not Sephardic, we were not Ashkenazi, so other Jews and the government were not sure exactly how to handle us in so many words. And there was discrimination, and the people started to suffer. I mean, the Bene Israeli community started to suffer. They were discriminated. They had high-ranking positions in India, and they came to Israel, and they were willing to work hard, but they saw other people without experience getting high-ranking positions, and they had the experience, and they were left out. So in the beginning, they started to bring their complaints in an orderly fashion, but they saw nothing is happening. So they started what is called the first civil rights protest in Israeli history, called the silent protest of 1951, 1952. And it culminated in the movement of leaving Israel, actually. And they were one of the first, if not the first, communities that started to leave organized and going back to India. And this was all over the newspapers. The first Prime Minister, Ben Gurion, was alerted, and the Indian Prime Minister, Nehru, wrote letters, and the whole thing started to become very, let's say, not very supportive to the new countries. So the protests were, as in India in the times of Mahatma Gandhi, they were peaceful. They were sitting, there were hunger strikes, and they left to India in 1952. Not everybody. Some of them fought in the War of Independence, but they felt discriminated, so they left. And when they came to India, they saw also in India, they were labeled as communists, and they were labeled as the troublemakers, and so they did not get their jobs back. And they found themselves actually not here, not there. They were, and soon after, a few years after, they started to return to Israel. I'll try to show a small clip, not the whole one.
בשלב זה מגיעה לישראל עלייה נוספת וייחודית. עדת בני ישראל מהודו שאנשיה נשלחים למעברת באר שבע. אנשי הקהילה, המשמרים במנהגיהם את המסורת עתיקת היומין שלהם, נתקלים בגזענות עזה ובתגובות של לעג והתנשאות. חמור מכך הוא פקפוק הממסד ביהדותם. בעקבות מותו של תינוק מבני העדה שלא טופל בזמן, יוצאת הקהילה למחאה פסיבית בנוסח גנדי.
העולים ההודים בחלקם מביאים את הניסיון של המאבק לשחרור של הודו, והם עושים מאבק.
איני מתאימה.
באחד המפגשים, כשאתה הופך כל הכתוב, שזה היה
והם עושים מאבק.
הרבה פתוח ישי, אתם צריכים.
בממסד הישראלי, במה
אנחנו נותנים את זה, כל התכונה העסקית.
לימים ינסו עד בני ישראל מאוד שבע.
If you can see this person here on the left, his name is Isaac Dandeker, and he was the leader of the demonstrations who led the Bene Israelis. Now, as I said, when they went back to India, they were also discriminated for what they did in Israel. So they started to come back, and a second wave of demonstration arrived in the late 1950s, and from 1960 to 1964, there was a second demonstration, and it's named the second demonstration. And this time it was based on religious discrimination, especially when Bene Israeli men and women started to intermarry with other Jewish communities. The rabbinical council started to question our Jewishness without any basis. And they conducted by themselves a huge study into our origins. And in 1962, there was a book published by the rabbinical council saying that there is no doubt about our Jewishness and about our origins, but still there were discriminations. And in this time, they were not so silent. Even the chief rabbi's image was put on a doll, and it was burned and kicked. And it culminated into the time that actually the leader of this demonstration, Mr. Samson Kileker, was even called the Indian Israeli Martin Luther King. And there were comparisons because also of the timeline with the civil rights demonstrations in the US and in Israel. And in August of 1964, the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Levi Eshkol, had his speech, which is called Our Brothers, the Bene Israel of India, and calling the rabbinical council to stop discriminating the Bene Israelis. Now, some people contradict this. They said that the rabbinical system actually is trying to help the Bene Israelis, but facts, figures, and documentation tell us differently. In 1964, again, the demonstration stopped, and waves upon waves started to come back to Israel, especially after the 1967 war, or the 6-day war, when Israel was several times, it's enlarged several times by its area, and more migrants from all over the world, but also from India, started to return and come to Israel. And in the 1960s, the numbers of the Bene Israeli in India started to dwindle for the first time, and they started to become larger and larger in Israel. And this photograph is from 1966. And about the heritage of the community back then. The heritage sites of the community is crumbling because the majority of the Bene Israelis during the ages, they left India. There's still a considerable community still in India, but today there are estimates of around 3,000 in a place more than 1 billion people. So today, most of the synagogues, cemeteries, and heritage sites are being destroyed by developers and dwellers because the community left, so nobody is there to protect it. Each year, we are losing centuries of family and community history. Once it's gone and not saved and documented, we lose part of ourselves as a community and also the larger Jewish world and humanity in general. It's part of everyone's history. Now, these are some of the photographs I took and some of my family archive photographs. And for example, on the upper left side, you see Askara ceremony or memorial ceremony of my great-great-great-grandfather, with my great-great-grandfather there and my great-grandfather. Now, this cemetery was around 500 years old, and now it's buried under a road. It's gone. This is one of the only photographs that shows that there was a cemetery there. And other cemeteries I photographed in the recent years, it's either overgrown by the jungles or either on the right side bottom, you can see a grave from the 19th century of Samuel Nogarka. And this grave is stuck in concrete because in one place called Panvel, the community still exists, but in small numbers. The synagogue it doesn't have a minyan, as we say. So some people moved to the cemetery and they just poured concrete onto graves from the 17th century, from the 18th century, from the 19th century, from the 20th century. Some just broke the graves. Some of the graves, sometimes you can find them as stools in the bathroom, and some of them are just lost. And this is history that is unfortunately not recorded. It was recorded on these stones, but we are losing them. And other places, the community still exists. You can see synagogues in the middle of a village in India. You can see the grandeur also of the community in ancient times, or in times that were 60 years ago or 70 years ago, and today there's almost no one there. And these are heritage sites, and they must be preserved, they must be documented, they must be taught and shown also as Jewish heritage sites, but also as Indian heritage sites. And this is some more of the photographs I took. Now, on some of the graves, you can see that it's written in Hebrew, it's written in Marathi, the local Indian language, and it's also written in English because it was under the British Raj. And this individual that passed in 1888, while he was 85 years old, was actually a high-ranking officer in the British Army. Now, you can see on the upper right side, a board sign. Actually, it's a street sign called Samuel Street. This is Samuel Ezekiel Dandeker. He's the one that built the first synagogue in Bombay. And today, the streets are being deleted. The names are being changed, and people are forgetting who were these individuals. There was an act to change the Samuel Street because they thought Samuel was a British person. It took a while to convince him he was an Indian. He was a Jewish Indian, or a Bene Israeli Indian. And it was saved, but the next street, which is called Isaji Street or Isaac Street, was deleted, and the name was changed. Now, in some of the places, the tombstones are broken. Now, you can see on the upper right side a cemetery that they just dug a trench towards it. I stopped them, I photographed it, and then they destroyed it. It's no longer in existence. Other places are kept by Muslims that befriended some of the Bene Israelis as young people, and they decided to keep the place, and they live there with the family, but the graves are kept. Some places you can see a goat tied up to a grave that somebody put there. And these are the conditions of the Hebrew, Bene Israel, or Jewish heritage sites around India. And actually, on the right and on the left bottom, you can see the first synagogue, and it was built in 1796, still in existence. The whole area was called Israel Mohalla. Israel Mohalla means the neighborhood of the Israel. Other places, you can see also Arabic writings in the Urdu language in a synagogue in a village called Borle. Nowadays, there's the last family that is left there. All the shofars, all the Torah scrolls, the ancient books are gone. Some of them in private collections, some of them in Israel, some of them are just gone and nobody knows where. But you can also see the connection between the different communities, written in Marathi for the Hindu community, written in Hebrew for the Bene Israel community, the Jewish community, and written in Urdu or Arabic for the Muslim community. And they lived peacefully with each other, mainly. This is across India. You can see places. These tombstones are from the mid-19th century. And this synagogue was made to a school with a promise that they will keep all the writings and all the plaques and the boards and the marble writings there, and they kept it. And today it's a school, so it's in use. It's different, but they still preserve the synagogue's characters, we say. This is more synagogues around India, some active, some are not active. Now on the upper right side, you can see two marble signs that today they are gone. I don't know who took them. Somebody took them. Maybe they are in private hands. Maybe they were taken by other people for usage. Maybe they were sold. It's hard to know at this point. Not impossible to know, but it's hard to know because the community left and everything is falling into disuse. And what the future holds is up to us, not only the Bene Israelis, but the government of Israel, the government of India, the larger Jewish community of the world. And what we decided to do in Israel, at least, and also in some other parts, is to start to revive our culture. And I'm part of different groups that are bringing our culture, the Bene Israeli culture, into the mainstream Israeli culture, like the Malida ceremony I mentioned before. And we are joining with other Indian Jewish communities, collaborating on stage in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, and across Israel, actually. And, well, that's about it. I think I want to save some time for people to ask questions, if there are questions, of course. So, hope I didn't talk too fast. I hope I didn't talk, my English was okay. So, that's all.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating, both the history and also heartbreaking just to see that so much of it is disappearing as well. First question that we have in the chat is from Suzanne Payne. The question is, where did rabbis and other Ben Israel leaders go for education and training?
Well, first of all, there were Jewish schools. There was the Israelite school. There was the Sir Eli Kaduri school that was the Israelite school, and later it became Sir Eli Kaduri school. There were other Hebrew schools. In my family line, for example, my great-great-great-grandfather was a Torah scroll writer, Sofer Stam. And a year and a half ago, I was invited to inspect a Torah scroll from 1852, written by my great-great-grandfather. And there was a whole article about it. So they taught through the generations, from father to son, from mother to daughter, and they taught them Hebrew, and they taught them the prayers. And like in shtetls in Europe or in villages in other places, in the Malach, as they say, that's the North African Jewish ghettos, and other places, that there were the rabbis or the cantors, especially, they were teaching the younger generation. So this is the same thing in India. They taught the younger generation. Some of them went and performed as cantors, and some of them just went on doing other stuff, but they did the prayers at home.
Bible.
So I want to say, for me, your English was wonderful. I mean, no problem following, and so interesting. I realize you may not know, but I'm just curious. Of course, over centuries, many groups have joined the Jewish people and are fully Jewish without biological descent. I'm aware of the DNA studies on the Bnei Menashe, but nothing's been published yet on the Bnei Ephraim, which doesn't mean that DNA studies aren't in the works, because it can take a few years. If you happen to know, are there any DNA studies going on for the Bnei Ephraim?
Yes, there are. Actually, there were several books published about it, and I have them in my archive, and I can send them later on, and maybe Ari, you can share the title of the
Bnei
book.
Ephraim, actually, not the Bnei Menashe?
About the Bnei Ephraim, yeah, the Bnei Ephraim.
Ah, and by chance,
or as they were called, the Telugu Jews, because of the Telugu language in that area in Uttar Pradesh. So, and I'm also in contact with some of them. So, genetic studies differs, and I can say that I did a genetic study. I'm not a geneticist, but I led a study with geneticists on the Bene Israel community, for example, and we found the connection amongst other stuff or other nations inside of us. So we found the connection, and but as you said, Judaism is not only genetics, and on the other hand, it is genetics. It's a philosophical questions, but genetically speaking, we did find evidence of the Bene Israel, the Baghdadis, the Kochinis, some of the Bene Menashe, and also some of the Bene Ephraim.
Barbara.
I wasn't going to mention this, but since Tybal asked, plus I have another question for you. I met with a group, a Jewish group led by a Rabbi Tokayer many years ago in India, a member of the Bene Ephraim. The Bene Ephraim live very far, I think it's east in India, very isolated. It took him 24 hours to come to visit with us when we were down in Cochin. He talked to us extensively, actually, and it was very interesting. They practice the Shabbat the way Orthodox Jews practice Shabbat. They're very, actually, they sounded like a very, very religious group. They don't have much money, which is one of their problems of trying to assert their Jewishness, because they're very impoverished. Our group actually paid for a couple of bulls to be sent, a female, not cows, I think they're the cow-like animal that you have in India, but they sent them pregnant ones or the milking ones, so because that allowed them to have enough money to improve their status in life. It was amazing what one milking animal did for their community. But my question actually to you, Elias, is the groups in India, the Kochinis are so far south they can't intertwine with the Bene Israel. The ones that came from Iraq originally didn't really, their language was so different that I think that's the reason that they didn't combine with Bene Israel. I could be wrong, but these other groups are all so separated in India that they're separate factions. When the families have moved to Israel, do they become more like just Indian Jews and all tend to combine, or do they still remain separate? Because I mean, like the Kochinis, they're virtually extinct at this point. There's only a couple of them left, and in Israel they're all older because everybody left to go back to Israel. You certainly have a lot more Bnei Israel and a lot more of the Baghdadis living up north, who are kind of coming closer to one another than they, I think, used to be. But in Israel, what's it like? Are they still separated? Is it the Kochinis here, the Bnei Israel there? Or do you kind of combine for everything?
Well, I can say several things about this. Firstly, the separation was not only based on, in India, back in the days, centuries ago, it was not only based on language or distance. It was prejudice. Really, they didn't like. Some said, "Are you Jews? Are you Jews? Are you Jews? Are you Jews?" You know, it started to go like that because they didn't know each other. I can say that one of my great grandmothers was a Baghdadi Jew, and I have another distant cousin that she is descendant from the Bene Israel, of course, the Baghdadis and the Kochinis. So there were some intermarriages, but generally speaking, they were kind of keeping away, so to speak. Now, all of that changed when they came to Israel. I mean, generally speaking, by historical facts, the Bene Israel were more acceptable and they were more open-minded. The Baghdadis and the Kochinis were more hesitant. I'm not saying that only because I'm a Bene Israel, because it's just facts. You can check me out. But in Israel, things changed. So they started to intermarry. In my family, for example, we have all the different types of different Jewish communities from east to west, from north to south, from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, from Australia, from Asia. So in regard of that, it changed. You know, prejudice. There was a prejudice here, of course, as I said in my talk, but the human connection was stronger. And should I even go so far and say love connections? So today in Israel, mostly they're intertwined in each other, although there is the Kochini settlements, Kochini kibbutzes in Israel, with a distinctive cultural heritage. There are Bene Israeli synagogues, with the Bene Israeli way, you know, and everything. But other people, Moroccan Jews come to a Bene Israel synagogue, Ashkenazi Jews going to a Kochini synagogue. So, and sometimes their children are married to each other. And the Baghdadi community is almost gone completely, I can say.
Really?
I mean, the elderly are still trying to write the books, and they write books and they do the cultural stuff, but the younger generation of the Baghdadis is almost completely assimilated. And in regard of the Kochinis, in Cochin itself, yeah, I mean, there were just a handful left, because most of them left. But in Israel, there are more than 7,000. So they moved here. And some of them also moved to the US and Canada and Australia, of course. But you can see the majority of the Indian Jews, and I exempt the Bnei Ephraim, but the Bnei Israel, the Kochini, and the Baghdadi, and now also the Bnei Menashe, of course, the majority lives in Israel.
Thank you.
I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, you did. I think it's nice that they're becoming more cohesive once they got to Israel. Once they got back to Israel, because originally, I mean, the Bnei Israel, like you said, all came from Israel, and the Kochanis all came from Israel. Bnei and the Baghdadis came more from Iraq and those countries, and came more
not only from Iraq, but yeah, what is today Iraq? Back then it wasn't Iraq. Yeah.
Right.
But today again, the communities are intermarried. I mean, my wife is a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, an Ashkenazi Jew, so you know. So everybody's
another question is that in the old days, the Baghdadi Jews involved a lot of people like the Sassoons and a couple other families that end in Un, and they had money.
Yeah.
But yet they're, like you say, they're kind of getting non-existent now. What happened to them? It's hard to believe that they became impoverished with the money.
No, they got richer. And you can see the Sassoons in the House of Lords in England.
Oh,
and
really?
you can see them. Also, some of them are actors, actually. And some of them, actually, I bought my wedding suit from a descendant of David Sassoon, which is also named David Sassoon. He's a designer here in Israel. So, no, they didn't become impoverished, and that is why they disappeared. They just assimilated in the different places. Also for money, some of them married the Rothschild family. And there's actually an actor, Jack Houston, is descendant from the Sassoons and the Rothschilds. So, and some of them are not Jewish anymore. Some of them intermarried with other faiths, so on and so forth. But their identity as Baghdadis disappeared. Genetically, they're still with us.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right, great. Well, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. Oh, Tybal, one more from Tybal. Go ahead.
It's not a question, just to thank you again for Ari and thank our speaker, and just to say, Kesher does it again.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, Kesher is a great place.
Great. So I will have Eliaz send me all of sort of the back end stuff that he had talked about, and we'll share that with the group, whatever he's willing to share. And thank you all again for joining us. And I will be sending out the next 2 months when they are planned, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone.